So, I don't really know where to start with this woman who has been very busy, a very dynamic person, and she is, of course, she's here to talk about the Senate and the Canadian Senate, and to be or not to be, and Knut has a T-shirt like that on, so pay attention to that. She was an independent senator in 1998, and I think she retired about 10 years ago. So she's talking about that. She's also done so many things. She is a United Church minister, ordained minister, since '65, and she was the first woman moderator of the United Church of Canada, and the moderator is responsible for the whole national church, and she did that in 1980. She has done all kinds of things in the world, and that. About some of that is the book that she is selling that Tad will have be selling outside the door for $20. I want to be in that number, and all kinds of people have contributed to it. Cool saints I have known, people like Margaret Lawrence, Ted Scott, who was the Anglican primate. All kinds of interesting people, and it's been a family production as well because her daughter edited it and her granddaughter did the designs on it, and so. But she's going to have some interesting things to tell you, and interesting things about all. Like I can't imagine all the things she's done. I don't know how she's managed to keep going, and she's had a recent birthday that is. That's kind of a significant birthday. So anyway, I'll ask Lois to come forward, please. Lois Wilson.
If you can't hear me at any point, just put your hand up and I'll slow down, because I tend to speak rather quickly. I'm delighted to be back in Lethbridge. I haven't been here for, oh golly, since '81 when I was moderator. And the main thing I remember is the university set in the hill, isn't that right? And Erickson was the architect? Yeah, I remember that about Lethbridge. But I'll carry different memories back after meeting some of you people today. So I've chosen to take the topic from Knut's T-shirt, to be or not to be, the Senate. And I want to explore three areas. One would be, what is the intended purpose of the Senate, since very few people know that. My personal experience of the Senate is the second area. And the third one was, what are our options for the future? And that's the most important part. So I'll try and say less about the first two and get to the options as quickly as I can. So first, the intended purpose of the Senate. There would be no Confederation, there would be no Canada unless we had the Senate. It was a deal broker, so Quebec and the Maritimes would not come into Confederation unless they had equal representation with Ontario, so that there were only three regions at that time, Quebec, Maritimes, and Ontario, and Quebec and the Maritimes said, we don't want to be overpowered with all those people from Ontario. So so it was not rep by pop, it was equal representation. Now since then, of course, Canada's greatly changed, and now we have the West. They call it the West. Don't differentiate by provinces. So something has to be adjusted there. But the main principle was to have equal representation from each region so that the people in that area could have a voice. And that meant a representation from minorities. That's very important because that's not taken into consideration in the Commons. It was the minorities that were to be represented, not only the provincial minorities, but the ethnic minorities, gender minorities, and so on and so forth. Its main purpose is what we call responsible government. And we inherited this from the UK, so we have the Crown, which is the overall symbol, independent symbol. We have the Commons, who are elected, who are parties, and their function is to hold the cabinet accountable. And the function of the Senate is not to govern, but to hold accountable those who do, which is the Commons and the cabinet. That's its purpose. Now, It used to be an appointment for life, but that was changed back in '68, I think. Many people don't know that. So I had to retire when I was 75, to my great regret. I still love to be there, even with the mess it's in. It needs somebody to help it along, I think. But the Senate are all appointed by the Governor General on the recommendation of the Prime Minister. And as I say, to check on the elected body and to keep it responsible. To say that senators are elected does not mean it's illegitimate. We have judges are not elected, ombudsmen are not elected, commissioners are not elected. There's a variety of people in governance in the Canadian system that are not elected. And I should know, because legitimate election does not automatically confer legitimacy. I mean, look at our mayor in Toronto, for example. Anyway, I just mentioned that. The pluses in the Senate, briefly, are the continuity and historical memory. Some people are there, some people stay far too long, but if they stay for a fair length of time, there is historical memory, and that's really important in governing a country. You also don't have to get reelected, so you're not constantly looking over your shoulder. You can say what you think, and there's a vast range of professional experience there. Now, the minuses are you do get a sense of entitlement. I mean, I had all these guys saluting me, and at first I saluted them back. I didn't know what they were saluting me for. But they do make you feel as if you are somebody, and you might get confused and think that. So that's one of the minuses. And as in every organization, 10% of the people do the work, and the others come along for the food. So those are the minuses. Those are some of the minuses. There are other ones too. So the main function is to review the legislation that comes from the Commons. And the senators review every piece of legislation. It cannot be into law until it's been looked at by a Senate committee in clause by clause. It's really, really detailed work. And it's backed up by professional research by the Library of Parliament, which is the best library in the country, I think. And the Senate can adopt the legislation or amend it or reject it. It very seldom rejects it. That is just not done because understood that the elected Commons are the legislators. The senators are to keep them in check and accountable. Senate keeps an attendance record, so I mean, you can tell if your senator's been in Mexico for the summer or the winter. We also are televised, so it's open to the public. In terms of the legislation, there are 3 instances I can think of where the Senate stepped in and summarily rejected what was happening. One was Tad Matsui told me in 1949, there was an order that the Canadian government was going to send all the Japanese back to Japan as enemy aliens, came to the Senate and they rejected that. They rescinded that. Second thing I think of is on the abortion issue when it was a hot issue. And Pat Carney, who was a conservative, flew in from Vancouver to cast the deciding vote, which took abortion out of the criminal code. And the third one was the free trade agreement, NAFTA, where the Senate insisted on an open debate, and it was an election issue. So it wasn't just allowed to go through the way our current ones are going through. So those 3 instances is that it kind of justifies it in my eyes. But the thing that is mainly the contribution of the Senate are the committees. It's got a strong committee structure. And I've been testifying before the Commons committees, and I had some trouble there. They're more like a floating crap game because you go in and somebody's got another meeting, they're a very important meeting. They don't have time to listen to you, but they got to rush off to another meeting. Whereas in the Senate, that's your job. That's your only job almost. And so you sit there, and it's recommended that senators sit on only 2 committees because you got a lot of work to do. And I read the memoirs of Eugene Forsey, who was a senator, and he chose to be on the Committee of Regulations, which is a very smart move, because the regulations are key to legislation. For example, the government passes a bill that says the budget is deemed to be approved without examination. Everything is deemed to be okay, but nobody's ever looked at it. And Eugene got himself in that committee to say, I object to that. I object to it's deemed to. We're going to look at that clause by clause. It's also very useful when if the government passes an omnibus bill, which nobody's looked at, and there's things hidden there, and you can't get it debated because it's an omnibus bill. When it comes to the Senate, their job is to look at everything carefully, turn it back if it needs amending. And also if a bill is fast-tracked, which leads, of course, to closure, which leads to no debate. So those three instances, I think, justify the committee structure. My most lasting work was on the Human Rights Committee, since that's been my life work, as you'll find out if you read my book out there. That book is mostly my human rights work with the ecumenical community worldwide. But I looked at Canada's human rights record, particularly in terms of the way we treat Aboriginal people. And my one accomplishment in the Senate after 4 years was to establish a standing committee on human rights in the Senate, whose function is not to take pot shots at Colombia and China and all those people who violate human rights, but to look at Canada's record. How do we treat the conventions that we sign? I mean, the UN Convention on the Child, those wonderful UN treaties. We're wonderful Boy Scouts internationally, but it is not embedded in domestic legislation. So that was my work. And it's still there. They're still looking at it. So I was proud of that. So that's mainly about the intended purpose of the Senate. Secondly, how I found it, my own experience there. I got this call, I was telling Tad, I was home and I got this call saying, would I consider allowing my name to stand as a possible appointee to the Senate from Ontario? And I'm afraid I laughed because, like, I don't fit the image of a senator. And I thought, like, I'm not tall, I'm not male, I haven't got a paunch, I haven't got gray hair. And my husband said, don't laugh, I think it's serious. So I had 3 questions I had to ask this person who was acting on behalf of Chrétien. What does the Senate do? Because I have no idea. What's my time commitment? Because I really like to ski, and I'm not going to give that up. And thirdly, I'm not a liberal, I'm not a conservative, so I'll have to sit as an independent. He said, well, I'll have to phone you back on the first 2, like, what does it do? He didn't know. It was somewhat hilarious. But he did get back to me on that. And he said, well, actually, the Chrétien would consider appointing you as an independent. And I said, great. And so he did. And I sat as an independent. I only had 4 years. They didn't think of me soon enough. And you have to retire when you're 75, but that's how it was appointed. The requirements for appointment are not arduous. You have to be over 30. You have to own $4,000 worth of property, and you have to reside in the province, the residency. You've heard of that one. And so I was okay on all of those. The requirements of residency are not as strict as a minor hockey league requirements. They really need to be tightened up. And it worked on the honor system. Some people did not honor the honor system. So we have appointments of 104 senators. We have 10 from New Brunswick, 10 from Nova Scotia, 4 from PEI, 24 from Quebec, 24 from Ontario, 24 from the West. Do you like that? Yeah. 6 from Labrador, 1 from Nunavut, 1 from the Yukon, and 1 from the Northwest Territories. So that's not very good either, but that's the way it is right now. The minorities are well represented in the Senate the way they are not in the Commons, because it's an appointment system. For example, women, we had 35% women when I was there, as opposed to 20 in the Commons. And we had 2 from the Arctic, we had somebody from Acadia. You get groups represented there that are not represented by the electoral system, and I applaud that. Because I sat as an independent, I was freed of going to all caucuses, which was a great, great gift. But I knew what was going on, because I would say to somebody, what happened in the Liberal caucus today? What did you think of it? And they'd say, what did you think? Oh, no, I'd say, I'd like to hear from you first. And they'd tell me everything. They thought I was in it. And I'd do the same with the Conservatives. So I knew what was going on, but I didn't have to spend every morning in caucuses. So because of that, the foreign minister became aware of this and began to appoint me to things that needed doing, representing the Liberal government. And he trusted me, and he knew I was an independent person. So he appointed me as a Canada's special envoy to the Sudan, which, as you may know, is split by civil war, and we tried desperately to broker a peace process, but we weren't able to. But I did that, spent a lot of time on Sudan. He appointed me to lead a delegation on religious freedom in China, which I was well equipped to do because of my international ecumenical experience with the churches. He asked me to go to North Korea to kind of soften up the North Koreans in preparation for diplomatic relations, which we later did establish. We actually had diplomatic relationships with North Korea for 2 years before that was rescinded. And I remember sitting in the Western Hotel in Ottawa meeting these 2 Koreans from the north who said, you know, we're here to look at a place for an embassy, but we've just been told by Foreign Affairs that pack up and go home because we're not going to play with you anymore. And that was the end of that. And I guess we did that, and I support this, that it's much better to talk, to engage, even with the enemy, than to throw bombs, than to fight. And I still maintain that. I was also very active because I was a woman, and in my period in the Senate, the time for the celebration of the famous 5, you Westerners should know about the famous 5 women, yes, who got women recognized as able to run in the Senate. And we celebrated that, and to celebrate that, the Commonwealth invited me to go to England and speak about the women's situation in governance in England and Scotland and Ireland, which I really loved. So I was able to do quite a bit in that area, also with the United Nations. And that's all because I sat as an independent. The downside was that I was robbed of some time to look at the legislation, but my colleagues were there, so that was fine. So I'm saying this because I think the committee work of the Senate is the best contribution it makes. It's not well known, but it's thorough, it's taken seriously, and it's there. And there are enough resources given to you to do your work properly. I mean, I couldn't believe it. As a minister, United Church minister, I never even had a secretary, and then I had 4 people working for me. It was wonderful. Whoa. You know, I had 1 on Sudan, 1 on China, 1 on women, and 1 on what was coming from the Commons. So you had all this stuff laid out. All right, now this is the most important part. What are the future options? Would we be better without a Senate? Without a Senate, if we simply abolish it, it would give increased power to the cabinet and to the bureaucracy and to central Canada, I'm convinced of. But apart from that, it's practically impossible. You remember when Stephen Harper went to the Supreme Court and asked about abolition, and all the provinces except Alberta and Saskatchewan said it requires unanimous support of all the provinces. So at that point, Stephen Harper dropped it when he realized it was going to be impossible constitutionally to do so. And I think if we are for abolition, you better look at then what is going to put in its place. So if that disappeared, what would you put in its place? Because that's not often talked about. Elected Senate, well, that's sometimes the option. I'm wary of that when I look at the US system, which is not our system, which has 2 elected competing bodies, which frequently are in dreadlock. I think if we had an elected Senate, since they would represent the province, they would represent more people than an MP elected from a constituency would have more power, and therefore they would be in competition there. If we kept the same length of term for senators, they'd be there long after the Commons people were defeated, which again gives them more power. So I have a lot of questions about elected Senate. However, I have a problem with Trudeau, who says we declared them all independent. I mean, when all is said and done, the Senate is a political entity in the responsible government setup, so it's not apolitical. And the question is, and political parties are partisan and should be. How to be partisan but independent is the question. You know, how to be a good conservative or a good liberal but independent. And I think Trudeau should be preparing the people for constitutional change, not simply making a statement like that. I was at a forum like this in Toronto, and Art Eggleton was there, and he's in the Senate. He used to be mayor of Toronto, so I thought he'd been going on and on about how we need everybody independent in the Senate. So I went up to her afterwards and said, Art, that's a wonderful idea. When are you going to declare yourself an independent? He said, I can't, I'm a liberal. I said, exactly. So there's a lot of empty rhetoric around this, I think. There need to be some independence to give a healthy balance, and I certainly held the independence. Well, about 4 people became independents after I joined, and we began to have the balance of power, which is a very interesting situation. Okay, the options. If we're going to talk about reforming the Senate, we need to talk about reforming the Commons as well, because it's all of an entity, and boy, do they need it. From the voting system, which is first past the post, so that the Prime Minister can govern with 35% of the votes, to the speeches, which are usually scripted, and so you got a dysfunctional. There's no real debate now. If you've ever watched Question Period, I met a parliamentary assistant. I won't tell you to whom, at a dinner the other night in Ottawa, and he said to me, "You know, it's only a title. I can't do anything because my bosses won't allow me to." And I said, "Well, what would you like to do?" And he said, "I would like to bring together all the top faith leaders in Canada to see if we have shared core values, to see how that can be translated into some of our legislation. But I can't do that because I'm not allowed to." So there needs to be some reform at several levels there. The appointment system is abused by every Prime Minister, although it's legal, so I shouldn't say it's abused. They can add 8 seats if there's a crisis, and they have all done it. So Mulroney did it to get NAFTA through. Creighton did it to get the Clarity Bill through, and I was pressured for that one, and it's there. You know, what we should be looking at is the systems of other countries that have representative government. The UK, for example, have set up an appointments commission. Now, you may think their House of Lords is antediluvial, but it's way ahead of our Senate now because they have reformed it. This appointments commission it consists of 7 people, a chair, somebody from each political party, and 3 non-political people. Their work is confidential. They recommend applicants. They call for applicants to the House of Lords. You could apply to be a senator. And of the 5,000 they had, they could only choose 100. So they really looked at a range of experience that they wanted and recommended it then. They also vet nominees of the Prime Minister because he's still able to do that. But that seems a very good system to me. They get people with very broad experience. Another little twist is that the appointments sometimes alternate between party leaders. So the Prime Minister doesn't always have the same appointments, but the Leader of the Opposition gets to do that on alternate years. Caribbean nations are ahead of us in that they say that appointments to their upper house alternate between the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and the Governor-General. So every 3 years, the Prime Minister gets the chance, and every 3 years, the Leader of the Opposition gets it. Every 3 years, the Governor-General gets it. So those seem to me as viable alternatives that we should look at. And the voting system, too. I know there's great controversy around that. I was elected a moderator of the United Church on the single transferable ballot. You know, I was elected, I think, on the 5th ballot. So you do it, and then somebody drops, and then so those people transfer their votes to somebody else. And so by the time you get to the winner, at least you know they got the majority of the people. And the other thing is proportional representation, which is quite controversial. But there are countries that do it, New Zealand and others, that I think we could learn from. And instead of just, you know, without really thinking, say, let's abolish the Senate or let's elect it, why don't we look at some of the alternatives to keep what I think is a very useful system of government with a long history of workability, but it needs a lot of tweaking. Let me just finish up by saying that the ethical question is central in my view. I can't believe why these senators need an ethics commissioner. Aren't they grown people? Don't they know right from wrong? I think they do. And I just regret that some of them have brought the whole governmental system into disrepute. Because one of the things that we're desperately needing is to restore credibility to the whole political process in our country so that young people will begin to honor it and become involved and engaged, and we build together the kind of country we want. So ethics is central, but I don't think you're going to solve it by an ethics commissioner. So over to you. Thank you.